Rhubarb lived in a house with a very sunny garden, with trees and bees and bone holes and things that sniffed good and things that bounced, and he enjoyed the way things were. For most of his life, Rhubarb had been eating chairs and shoes and holes in carpets and even a tree. But try as he might, he couldn't eat the rubber bands. All the birds in the garden ate rubber bands, but every time Rhubarb went out to ask them how they found them, they would just jump into the sky and float about. As Rhubarb watched from behind the curtains up at the house, a big fat crow with a big yellow spike plucked a big fat rubber band right out of the ground. Not 3 paws from where he was hiding. "They're spikes," grinned Rhubarb. "They stick their spikes into the ground and pull out the rubber bands. Now, why didn't you think of that?" "Oh, because you haven't got a spike." "The next thing to being a bird," Rhubarb mumbled on in a knowing sort of way, "is being able to float about in the sky. And to find out how they do that, you'll have to get very close to one indeed." Now, what gets close to birds? 6.5 weary hours later, still disguised as a huge piece of bread, the birds began to bounce very close to him. "This is it," chuckled Rhubarb. "My crummy plan is working." And he lay still as still can be. "Aha! So that's how they bounce. This is fantastic. How clever you are." As all the birds bounced around, Rhubarb was able to see that they had very thin, flat arms, and that they would flap them with fury whenever they wanted to jump into the sky and float about. Rhubarb shook off his disguise as he decided the whole idea of being a piece of bread had gone a bit stale. "Oh, you're so funny," he said to himself as all the birds bounced up into the tree. Light shone from the only window in the shed as Rhubarb was working on Mark I of a machine on which he'd pinned all his hopes of ever getting at the rubber bands. As the sun came up over the conker tree, the oddest, doggiest character stood in the shed doorway, and then very slowly he trundled out into the center of the lawn. All the early birds came into the garden and sat in Rhubarb's tree and squeaked with excitement at the new strange sight. As Rhubarb reached the shade, he stood for a while, as all great dogs do before embarking up the wrong tree. Climbing gingerly into the seat of the swing, Rhubarb checked all his equipment.
"Flaps, spike, springs, all okay."
Quietly at first, Rhubarb started to make the noise of the holiday jets that fly over the garden on sunny days, the sound he'd perfected during the night. As the sound got louder, he gently lifted his legs off the ground.
"Springs up! We have lift off!"
shouted Rhubarb in a muffled tone from under his huge yellow spike.
"This is a great step for dog kind."
And as the wind whistled past his eyes and his little arms flapped with fury, Rhubarb felt himself being lifted higher and higher into the world beyond the 4 paws of dog. Rhubarb was so excited that he was the first dog ever to enter into flight that he forgot to flap his cardboard wings. And so with the piercing scream of a jet changing into the screaming pierce of a dog, he plunged towards the garden, and his big yellow spike plonked into the green turf and into rubber band land. An hour later, poor Rhubarb was still furious as all the birds for miles about came bouncing along on their springs. And even Custard, the big fat cat from next door, came to laugh. Rhubarb was stuck. Birds have beaks, and Rhubarb had a spike. And a beak is a beak, and a spike is a spike.